Okay, hello and welcome everyone to the Engineers Ireland lecture on professional and ethical responsibilities for engineers. I'm going to now introduce our speaker for today. Our speaker is Damien Owens, who is a Chartered Engineer and Fellow of Engineers Ireland. He is the Registrar and Chief Risk Officer of Engineers Ireland, and this role includes the setting and maintaining of academic and professional standards for the engineering profession. Key aspects of his role include implementing an active accreditation process for engineering programs delivered in Ireland to ensure they meet the best international standards. He also represents the interest of the engineering profession at a national and international fora and speaks on related topics in national and international media. Damien represents Ireland in international matters and has been elected President of the European Network for Accreditation of Engineering Education for the 2019-2020 term and the Chair of the International Engineering Alliance for 2019 to 2021. Both organizations set standards for engineering education and mobility across the globe. He is also a member of the Accreditation Board of the Hong Kong Institute of Engineers. Previously as a member of Engineers Ireland, he was chairman of the ICT division. He was a member of the executive committee and was elected to the Council of Engineers Ireland. And prior to Engineers Ireland, he worked in the telecommunications sector, focusing on product development and strategic alliances. He's been active on a number of national and international standard bodies, including the EU, ITUTS, and the National Standards Authority of Ireland, ETCI, and he currently participates in a number of national consultative groups. So Damien, I believe you have a very exciting lecture ahead of us today, and without further ado, I hand it over to you. Thank you very much, Damien.
Thank you, Michal. Welcome everybody. I suppose the topic of ethics is quite a complex, but quite a simple topic at another level. Much of the material I have here today is pretty much open source, so you can Google it and follow some of the videos online. I normally would have some videos, but they don't really share on this platform really well, but you can look them up later. So now the slides. Okay, so what does ethics mean to you? So this is, I suppose, the agenda for today. What does ethics mean? We look at the education of ethics, how they're explored, and the outcomes you expect. And then we look at some examples in the global context, real world examples with the difference between, I suppose, academic ethics and real world ethics and the issues they raise. And then lastly, brief look at the Engineers Ireland Code of Ethics and Engineers Ireland approach. First of all, the advertisement. If you're not a student member of Engineers Ireland, student membership is free to anybody studying engineering in the island of Ireland. So please log on. The URL is there. There are lots of interesting support materials, resources to help you, for example, for your career, interview techniques. We have lunch and learn videos, and this video, for example, will be available to watch later. So please do log on and join. So ethics, a definition: a system of moral principles, ethics of a culture, Christian ethics, moral principles of an individual, and a branch of philosophy dealing with values in relation to human conduct with respect to the rightness and wrongness of certain actions. So what does that mean? Well, what does it mean to you? For example, if the shop assistant gives you too much change, do you give it back? Very simple question. When you're driving your car, you go 10% over the speed limit, is that okay? You need to submit an assignment. So do you search online for a similar piece of work? Copying a piece of code for a project or music? We'll see some copying of code later. Or in a work context, giving too much work to an employee that they can't perform fully in the time allotted. Or not speaking out the knowledge that something is correct or incorrect. So they're the sort of very mundane questions which bring into focus what ethics is. And at some level, we've learned all this as children, and you're bringing what you've been raised with into the real world, and that's going to be guiding a lot of your actions for the rest of your life. So getting all that in context. So from an education perspective, here's the formation of a chartered engineer, professional engineer. We have academic education, initial professional development, which is the application of your education into the real world. And then an assessment to become a chartered engineer. And then after that, continued professional development. Again, from an ethics perspective, We have education and assessment of, I suppose, the ethical knowledge in the academic environment. Your initial professional development, however, we now have real-world application in learning, and that's then assessed by engineering peers as part of the chartered engineer process. And then there's continued professional development throughout the rest of your career to stay current, and that's quite important, staying current and learning as your particular field of engineering advances. This is the current Engineers Ireland accreditation criteria, and this is what we use to assess engineering programs that they're delivering specified outcomes, and that students and graduates coming from those programs have acquired a requisite level of learning. So these are data from 2014. They're being updated, and there'll be a new version out in January of next year. One of the program areas there is professional and ethical responsibility. So this builds on what was there previously. But you can see from the green text that, you know, ethical responsibilities extend are quite far-reaching. So it's into the practice of engineering, an understanding and appreciation of the environment, social and economic impacts. The need to act with honesty, integrity and objectivity, knowledge and understanding of the importance of equality, diversity and inclusion, understanding commitment to ethical usage of technology and data, an understanding of health and safety. So you can see it's quite broad ranging, so it covers a lot of areas which you may encounter throughout your career and life in general. Where that comes from is a series of standards that are being developed between the International Engineering Alliance and also INEA, which is European Network Accreditation of Engineering Education. So this ensures that the context, the ethical context and other contexts within the accreditation process are back-to-back with global standards. So when you go overseas and somebody looks at your qualification, they'll know that these outcomes have been achieved as part of your program. So what feedback do we get on our accreditation visits? Well, from students. Well, in general, the interpretation of ethics is generally interpreted quite loosely, and it's usually confined to plagiarism. And this is what people think. Well, you ask students, they'll say, well, ethics is all about plagiarism, which is much broader than that, as we can see from the previous slide. And teaching ethics as a module, it's ineffective. So it has to be spread across the entire program. So for example, if you're studying electrical engineering, you need to be aware of the standards for recycling, for example, of electric equipment. And college policies sometimes are not adequately explained or understood by students. Diana Martin from TU Dublin has undertaken an extensive review of, I suppose, how ethics has been treated and how it's been measured during the accreditation process. And that's a body of work that's coming to fruition now. Here's our feedback from the public. So this is a survey of 1,300 members of the public in 2018 as to who they think is competent and who would tell the truth. So doctors are come out at the highest. It's highly competent at 93%. And 92% of the public would trust a doctor to tell the truth. Engineers are number 2 on the list. So 91% of the public expect engineers to be highly competent, and 90% would think that engineers would tell the truth. And you can see the comparators there for other professions. And holding up the bottom is our political representatives. So real-world ethics, how does real-world ethics differ from academic ethics? Well, real-world ethics deal with uncertainty and future implications. The research constraints are removed, and you know all these problems now have very vague boundaries or none at all. There are different cultural interpretations, so it's accepted in one culture is probably not acceptable in another. And that's significant if you're, say, working overseas. You need to be aware of those perspectives. There's ethical creep. So, you know, people get away, the speed limit 60 kilometers an hour, you drive at 65, that's okay. And then, you know, a few days later, well, you know, 70 kilometers an hour isn't much faster than 65. And before you know it, you're doing 120 if you keep creeping like that. And there's other influences that put pressure on engineers in the workplace: cost, time, relationships, and humans' performance factors. They all come into the mix in the real world and make problem solving very, very complex. So this list is some episodes of engineering failures, and they demonstrate, I suppose, the ethical impact of decisions in all sectors. And I suppose the key thing to learn from this is that, that the ethical impact or the impact on the environment can happen a very long time after a decision has been taken. We'll talk about some of them in a little bit more detail. The space shuttle, the Therac, and Chernobyl, as you can say, they all happened around 1986, which seemed to be a pretty grim time for disasters. Bhopal disaster was in India. Love Canal is a very interesting one, and I think there's been movies about it. The Love Canal was a canal that was being built in Buffalo, North New York State, and then they stopped. They gave up on the canal, so basically left with ditch. So they filled it with rubbish and contaminated materials. It was then covered over, and over the years leaked and caused a range of diseases. The Fort Pinto we look at later on, and the CTV building collapse again on the very bottom is a very interesting one. That was the Canterbury TV Tower building in Christchurch in New Zealand in 2011. And the issue there is that one of the engineers working on the project had basically used forged documents. They had appropriated someone else's identity. The building collapsed and killed 115 people during an earthquake. So that had huge ramifications for the engineering profession as a whole in New Zealand. So the Challenger disaster is probably one of the famous case studies, and there's a YouTube link on the bottom there which you can look at. The Challenger disaster, the Challenger exploded about 30-40 seconds after takeoff in January 1986. And the problem was that as the rocket is made in a number of sections, and between those sections there's a number of rings, O-rings, which will expand and fill the gap created as the metal of the rocket itself expands. However, it has never been tested at 30 degrees, which is 30 degrees Fahrenheit, which is roughly zero. So it's never been tested at low temperature. And this launch was taking place when the temperature was low. Now, there was a huge amount of pressure on NASA to launch. If they missed this window, they couldn't launch for 6 months. But equally, the Russians were starting to do commercial launches, so there was huge commercial pressure. And if we look at some of the forces in play, okay, there was the weather, and there was a short weather window to get this rocket off the ground. If not, it would be gone for 6 months. There was the commercial pressure, national prestige. Morton Thiokol were the maker of the O-ring, and NASA asked Morton Thiokol if the O-ring would work at that temperature, and it never been tested that low. And I suppose the Morton Thiokol management team met up, mostly engineers, and so their fear was, if they missed this, there's reputational damage in them, there's litigation. So they gave the go-ahead. They said, yeah, it'll be okay. And NASA themselves were surprised to get the go-ahead, that the ring was okay. They in the later investigation, they were surprised. And one of the famous quotes that came out of the inquiry was from Morton Thiokol, the meeting of the engineers to discuss the problem. And one of the engineers was told to take off his engineer's hat and put on his management hat. And that's a very famous quotation that came from that investigation. We all know the results of it. The rocket exploded. The company then changed their name after that, but they're as far as I know, they're still operational. So if we look at another disaster around that time, 1986 was Chernobyl. And again, it was a meltdown of a nuclear reactor. But what caused it? Well, on the day of the disaster, they were supposed to undertake some tests, and they trained the staff to do tests, to test some of the cooling systems and run them in a certain way. However, because of an outage elsewhere on the network, they needed to stay in production. So the test was postponed. Later that night, when another part of the network came back on, they decided to do the test. However, the night shift had not been trained on how to conduct the test properly. That was one aspect of it. And the other aspect was that the test was supposed to be done at 30% of output capacity. However, they ran it at 50%. So because the staff weren't fully up to speed on the training and what the test was supposed to do, it was a failure. The reactor overheated, and as you say, the rest is history. So it's a human factor rather than technology factor that's at the root cause here. But that's something we have to be aware of. You may design something, but they may not be the people that you want to do it that's actually doing the work. Therac 25 is a computer-controlled radiation machine for administering radiation doses to patients in a hospital. And again, this accident took place again in the mid-80s. The Therac 25 was produced by a Canadian company. Now, the previous two versions of the machine, they had worked with a French company. So in other words, they had done a venture with a French company for the previous versions of the Therac machines, and then produced their own. In order to increase the throughput of patients, so for example, after there's a set number of procedures have to be undertaken before you can bring patients into use the machine. So to speed up the throughput, they undertook a few developments. They removed some of the safety interlocks. So the previous versions of safety interlocks to stop administering too much radiation, and a lot of these were switched off. The software, some of the software in the machine had been copied from a previous machine, so it was quite unsuitable. It's copied from a different model. So the combination of those events meant that a number of patients received hundreds of times the dose of radiation that they should have. So it's a very good example of, I suppose, from the coding perspective, and also that the engineers were overconfident in their abilities to just modify things on the fly, and the consequences of that. A good example of groupthink. This is Alice Stewart. Alice Stewart is not an engineer, was not an engineer. She's a scientist, and started off as a nurse. But in the 1950s, she undertook research in the UK. She noticed something as a nurse, that there was a high level of deformity in birth defects. So she undertook a survey, some work with £100 funding, and she discovered that there was a high correlation between birth defects and X-rays being undertaken during pregnancy. And because she was not a doctor, she basically got, her views were I suppose, debunked by the medical profession. In the US, just in the UK, in the US, they thought her work was good, but they waited until they could get proper computational power before they could confirm it for the US population. That happened in the early 60s, and the US stopped, issued an edict to stop X-raying pregnant women. They still continue to X-ray pregnant women in the UK until 1969, even though the risk was well known. Another good example is the Ford Pinto. Ford Pinto was a car that was introduced in the 70s at a certain price point in the market. During the production, early in the production, Ford noticed that the car, the rear petrol tank in the car was vulnerable to explode in the rear end impact. However, it still conformed with the requirements at the time, which was an impact up to 25 kilometers or 25 miles an hour. So Ford did the analysis. How much would it cost to fix this car? Because they're going to produce 3 million units of them. And the cost of retrofitting. So they worked out the cost. It was going to cost $11 per car to fix, and they're going to produce 3 million. So you can do the math, 33 million or thereabouts. But then you said, okay, what's the chances of, how many many people would get injured, the cost of litigation, and they balanced the sum. So, you know, it was a legitimate way of doing things. So, and they kept the production going. And then following one accident and one litigation claim, I suppose there was a raid done on the Ford offices, or there was full disclosure, and they discovered these documents, and Ford got, I suppose, castigated for taking that approach. Now, they were vindicated 10, 15 years later, because the approach they were taking was right. They put a financial figure on it, they weighed up all the risks. They may have taken the wrong decision, but the process they used to get the decision was at least correct and became a benchmark. But it's a very good example of, I suppose, having all the information, but perhaps just taking the wrong decision at the end. And if we look at today's car, it's full of technology, seat sensors. So you have 3 children in the back, your GPS. So, you know, from a marketing perspective, we know that you've been on the road for 3 hours. We know you have 3 children. They're going to be hungry. So we're going to pop an ad for them. And there's a big debate going on to get this information from the car makers. So far, the car makers have stood firm and not provided this, but the information is there, and you can, maybe you'll get a free car if you allow adverts on your dashboard. Going back to the theory for a moment, this is the trolley bus problem from 1967. It's a very simple problem. There's a trolley bus, or a tram in our language, is hurtling down the track. It's out of control. You have 5 people lying on one track and 1 person lying on the other. So which way do you divert the trolley bus? So it's, you know, on the maths, it looks simple. You divert it to the 1 person and save the 5 other people. And then you build layers onto the complexity. That 1 person is your mother or your partner. Will you divert the train there? So, and the problem keeps building up other layers on top of that. So it's not that simple when you analyze it in depth. But if you think about it, we're already there. The driverless cars are now the trolley bus problem. We heard of the Tesla that mistook the white lorry for the sky and drove into the side of it. Now, you know, driverless cars, and we're always told the autonomous car, the driverless car is literally just around the corner, pardon the pun. But, you know, that car will be driving down the road. A bus coming towards her, or a lorry coming towards her, might have a blowout and swerve in front of it. So that car then either has to stop and avoid a collision, if it can, or swerve onto the footpath and hit a pedestrian, or go the other way into the oncoming traffic, or hit the cyclist coming up the other side of the road. So the car will do something. It's an autonomous car. It's being programmed to do something. Somebody has wrote that code. An engineer somewhere has, you know, analyzed this problem and written that code. Did he get it right? Who knows? But, you know, bear in mind, somebody has to write that code. And then we had the Dieselgate, if people remember, the diesel emission scandal. This was in 2015, Volkswagen, and they're still paying the prices, still going to the courts, they're still paying compensation in various jurisdictions. But, you know, Ford got cut out of this in 1997, Kia in 2014, Hyundai in 2014, then Volkswagen. So the question there, you know, do we learn from each other's mistakes? Do we ever learn? Here's a repetition of the same thing over a period of 10 years. And you would expect that, you know, we would have learned. And what are our next case studies? Will it be the Boeing 737 or drone wars? There's a company working on, basically, we'll just have drones that will be fighting each other and taking out other people's infrastructure. It's getting like a video game. So, you know, if, you know, you're sitting in a bunker, just moving a mouse, controlling a drone thousands of miles away and firing lasers or bombs from it, you know, how ethical is that, I suppose? Artificial intelligence is underway, or getting there. And we have GPT-3, which is the new, I suppose, language has become quite powerful and getting good vibes at the moment. Generative pre-trained transformer is what it stands for. It's a bit of a mouthful. Hacking of toys. Now that we're coming to Christmas, Internet of Things. There's been hacking of teddy bears in Germany. The German authorities have issued an edict to take them off the market. Very easily hacked into. You get a bear that can talk to you with a video. It'd be very, very powerful if you hack in there and talk to a 4-year-old. Go over and open the door and let me into the house. Thank you. Yeah. You've got your Amazon Alexa or Google devices in the home that you can speak to. They can be controlled by laser light. So you use a modulated laser light. You can shine it through the window and control an Alexa without any sound. So things can be happening without you knowing it in the house. Hacking of an aircraft took place. There was a Boeing 757 was hacked in 2016. Now, when I say hacking, it was hacked from the terminal building while the aircraft was parked. It wasn't in midair. But I think the hacking was done to prove that you could get into the avionics and control it. The details of the hacking, it was an ethical hacking, it was controlled. Only came out 2 years later, presumably after they'd fixed the bugs. But I suppose that poses a very different question. If you're in avionics, are the entertainment systems at the back of the aircraft, where all the passengers are, playing video games or watching movies, are they firewalled from the avionics in the cockpit? You would like to think so. But even without going into the avionics, supposing you hacked into the entertainment system and just put up a message, just there's a bomb on this aircraft, there would be mayhem. You've effectively achieved the same result just by a mass hysteria by sending a message to the passengers. Again, electric cars, what issues will arise there? Solar panels, are they the next big problem? There's a lot of the older solar panels are coming out of active operation, and they're quite dirty in terms of recycling. So new technologies are always, they're always full of promise. They're a bit like the puppy here, cute, cuddly. We expect a lot. The problem is, will this dog grow up? Will this pup grow up to be an assistive to humankind and help us out and improve our lives? Or will it end up attacking us? We don't know that answer. And that's the challenge when you're bringing in new services, new technology. Everything is formed within our own mindset and framed within our own mindset, and they are full of bias, and we need to be aware of all of that. So at Engineers Ireland, we have a code of ethics, and it sets out, I suppose, guidelines for behaviours we expect from professional engineers. It looks across a number of areas: contractual areas, conflicts of interest, and acting in the common good and advances of human welfare. And there's an obligation then on members of Engineers Ireland to let us know if there's suspicion of a breach of the code of ethics. And engineers, as we said, from the accreditation criteria, need to be conscious of the effect of their work on society and the environment, and only take work for which they're qualified. And again, that's where you can get creep. Well, I've worked on a 10-story building, now I can work on a 20-story building. May not follow. In many jurisdictions, you need different licensing, different levels for different things. So you only do the work for which you are qualified. It also sets out the remedies and I suppose the investigation procedure that would follow through if there is a breach. And the ethics equation is quite complex. It involves you as a person, your beliefs, your mindset, your perceptions, and your self-rationalizing behavior, because people do rationalize what they do. And then there's, social norms. What's acceptable? What's the risk and reward in that environment? And the social impact on sustainability. And then you have external factors, such as the law and penalties, whistleblowing, commercial pressure. So they come into the mix as well. And then there's the engineering profession, which defines acceptable standards and puts in place safeguards. And there is evidence and work has been done to show that adherence to a code of ethics increases the I suppose the positive outcomes. So people are less likely to stray once they're adhering to a code of ethics. And if you look at the reasons for ethical failures, they tend to come from commercial pressure. We have to get this out the door now. Look, it's 99% ready. The production line is ready to go, so we're going to market. And maybe something's been left out, or we'll fix it later. And you can see that, for example, as some of the Tesla cars, when the production line wasn't up to speed, they would ship the car and then ship the dashboard. So that the car was being shipped by land, and the dashboard or other parts were shipped by air to get there before them, and you were assembled at the garage. So, you know, there's commercial pressures there. Groupthink, we've seen the effects of that, and the backfire effect is, I suppose, would be, they call it conceptual conservatism. It's basically if somebody is challenging your view, there's a tendency to stick even more rigidly to your view. So it's a bit like trying to convince a Man United fan that their team isn't really very good. And the more you try to convince them, the better their team is. So, you know, be aware of those effects. Again, overconfidence. I've done this here, therefore it will work there. Doesn't always follow. And too narrow perspective. We tend to look in the timeline horizon. We're looking in the near term, whereas the consequences of decisions we take may manifest themselves many years out. And remember the line: take off your engineering hat and put on your management hat. And this was said again prior to the launch of the Challenger. It's a very powerful quote to keep in your head, so that you maintain a perspective on I suppose the engineering decisions that you're taking. So why did you choose engineering? And these are the questions when we undertake an accreditation visit. We ask students, why did you do engineering? And these are the sort of answers we get. I always like taking things to the park. I'm interested in how things work, and to make society better. So don't forget that. This curiosity will help see problems in advance. When you come up with a design or something and you're finished with it, the first thing you need to do as an engineer is go back to when you were younger and take it apart and try and break it. And by trying to break it, you'll discover, you know, I left something out, or, you know, you get a better understanding of how it works. So try and break the work you do, and you'll get a richer solution to your problem in the end. So in summary, I suppose ethics education cannot be compartmentalized. It's such a broad area that you've got to take it, you've got to look right across social aspects, technology aspects, and the implications on society, so and sustainability. So it's a very broad subject. It brings in many aspects, your own personal beliefs, and the external forces, either from legislation, professional bodies. I suppose past ethical failures can help highlight future dilemmas. So we've looked at a lot of examples there, which you can go and look at on YouTube or on Wikipedia or whatever. And there's lots of very good research as to what went wrong and why they went wrong. And if you can learn from those, then we'll try and not make some of these mistakes in the future. But always remember, there may not always be a best solution or a least worst solution. And that's the dilemma I think we face as engineers, is the complexity in the real world. You know, that every problem isn't bounded. There may not be a final solution, just the least worst. And as engineers, we have to, you know, when we identify that least worst, that we bound off some of the I suppose the worst effects. And a strong code of ethics can help guide us as we move forward. Just some reading, if you want to. There's this is the reference material I looked at. The Pig That Wants to Be Eaten, from Julian Baggini. Those of you of a certain age will know where the phrase comes from. It's from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. But the pig that wants to be eaten has 99 sort of ethical dilemmas in it. Each of them is about 3 pages. So they set out, each dilemma is set out in 1 page and then discussed in 2 pages. And again, there's no right or wrong answer, but it gets you thinking in a very, very different way about everyday circumstances, everyday things. Willful blindness from Margaret Heffernan, I suppose, looks at how we just cannot see what's in front of our nose at times, and how we overlook things. And one of the examples she looks at is BP disaster, where the one of the operators in the control room in an oil refinery had worked like 15 shifts of 12 hours, some mad amount of hours, and was quite tired. And of course, as you're tired, your confidence level, your concentration level, it narrows, so they couldn't see what was going on in all the screens, even though they were flashing red. And predictably irrational, but early, he conducts a number of experiments trying to say, you know, if you're given $1, would you do this? It was $10, and so on. So lots of great little experiments in that book. And like I said, many of the case studies mentioned here are explored further on web-based articles. So thank you for that, and I'll gladly take any questions.
So just as we transition into questions, I just want to say thank you so much, Damien. That was a fantastic presentation, and I'm going to end the recording here now. And I'd just like to say a special thank you to TU Dublin for hosting this lecture on ethics in professional engineering. So thank you very much. The